Self-defense is instinctive to all living things. However, in our modern civilized world, we can lose touch with our instincts and become unaware of our potential vulnerability. Our environment has become so noisy that we fail to see when we are alone and unprotected. In an instant, this delusion of safety can be irrevocably shattered. Suddenly, we find ourselves open to attack and everything is at stake. Fortunately, self-defense is possible for everyone. By taking advantage of the natural weaknesses of your assailant's body, you can overcome a larger and stronger opponent. Every attack has a counterattack. There is always an opening that can be exploited. The techniques of Qi-Na encompass many practical methods of self-defense. Qi-Na can be learned by everyone, from the average citizen to the expert martial artist. Qi-Na techniques can be used to survive a life-threatening encounter. Qi-Na descends from the time-honored Chinese martial disciplines of Kung Fu. Kung Fu is a Chinese term that literally translates into skill that is acquired after hard work over time. Although Kung Fu is centuries old, it retains many valuable lessons for our modern world. It has been preserved for generations for this reason. This videotape is part of the Wing Lam Kung Fu Federation's instructional series on authentic and traditional Chinese Kung Fu. This federation was founded by Sifu Kwong Wing Lam to teach and promote traditional martial arts and culture. Sifu Lam is a master of the art of Kung Fu. Kung Fu includes hundreds of different styles of training from the vast history and huge population that is China. Sifu Lam specializes in several styles of Kung Fu, including the powerful fighting style from southern China, known as Hung Gar, the complex style from northern China, known as Shaolin, and the sophisticated style of Sun Tai Chi Chuan. Sifu Lam has been teaching in the United States since 1967 and has taught both in this country and abroad. Kung Fu can take a lifetime to master. Ancient warrior monks spent years in isolated monasteries practicing this discipline to achieve enlightenment. Fortunately, you do not have to be a master or a monk to defend yourself. Qi-Na extracts martial techniques from Kung Fu that take advantage of the natural weaknesses of the human body that anyone can use. This videotape will demonstrate techniques of Qi-Na used to counter a grab to your arms. Before these demonstrations, it is important to understand the meaning Qi-Na and its connection with Kung Fu. Some exercises will also be discussed to warm up your joints and increase your flexibility. These are important steps in preventing injury. In these demonstrations, each technique will be followed by variations and counterattacks. Qi-Na can be used to counter Qi-Na. It is crucial to understand that every attack can be countered, including your counterattack. Being flexible and adapting to the circumstances underlies all Qi-Na. Qi-Na can be translated loosely as controlling the opponent, attacking their weaknesses. Control is established through grabbing and restraining your opponent. Once you take control, you create an opening through which you can attack. These attacks are achieved primarily through the use of pressure points and joint locks. Any sort of martial technique that seeks to control the opponent's actions, then takes advantage of the body's natural weaknesses, can be considered Qi-Na. The individual character for Qin literally means grab. In a martial context, Qin has a deeper meaning, defined as control with a light force. The Qin is never used alone since by definition it does not resolve the conflict, it only establishes initial control. Qin techniques must always be followed with Na techniques. Na can be loosely defined as grabbing with increased power. These techniques attack the joints, muscles, and tendons. Na techniques may hyperextend your opponent's joints or attack their pressure points. A Na technique can be applied without being preceded by a Qin technique, since ultimately the opponent is subdued. Kung Fu is taught in sets or movement sequences similar to gymnastic routines that have been passed down for generations. Here is a set from Shaolin Kung Fu. Many of these movements are actually practicing Qi-Na techniques. These movements are frequently exaggerated to increase their difficulty, to challenge the practitioner to achieve a greater level of skill. Sets are very exacting in regards to body positioning, training the practitioner to remain balanced in the most extreme of situations. In regards to actual combat, these movements are not to be taken so literally. Each movement in a set must be adapted to fit the immediate situation of combat. These interpretations are always flexible, changing with every movement that the opponent might make. No application is rigid. Qina is the same. These techniques are from a set of Honggar Kung Fu. One of the major advantages of set practice is that these techniques can be practiced at full speed and power. Whenever sparring or working out with partner drills, both practitioners must withhold fatal impact from their strikes to avoid injuring their partners. When shadowboxing in a set, such as this, there is no holding back. If you practice these techniques with a partner, proceed slowly. Qina techniques will apply maximum leverage to vulnerable points on the body, and if this is practiced without caution, serious injury can result. In actual combat, these attacks would be made at full velocity and the opponent would be caught by surprise. An attack of this ferocity cannot be emulated for training without injuring your training partner. Students must practice prudence with the underlying realization that in a real fight there would be no holds barred. Frequently in these sets, Qina applications are difficult to interpret. Qina applications can be very subtle and require a deep understanding of the human body and its frailties. This is the soft-style martial art of Tai Chi Chuan. Its light and graceful movements conceal many effective Qina techniques. Strangely, many Westerners get so entranced by these movements that sometimes they fail to see these types of applications. One of the most important principles of Tai Chi Chuan is sensitivity to your opponent. Within every strong stance, there is some weakness. For every tough defense, there is an opening. To take advantage of these weaknesses and openings, one must be sensitive enough to be aware of them and quick enough to exploit them. This principle holds true for all styles of combat, especially Qina. It is the nature of Qina to depend upon the movements of the opponent. Qina does not greet force with force. Rather, it is sensitive to the root of that force and cuts it off at the source. This sensitivity is known as listening. Listening to your opponent so that you know where their balance lies is an essential skill. It is this ability that divides great fighters from mediocre fighters. Qina requires strong and flexible hands and wrists. The following exercises are recommended before practice. While keeping your forearms horizontal, rotate your wrists inward. Keep your fingers extended so that your fingertips travel in a circular pattern. Your palms rotate from facing the floor to facing the sky. Make your circling motions even and smooth, never jerky. Try to make the largest circle with your fingertips while keeping your wrists stationary. Beginning with your palm up with your thumb facing your side. Grasp your fingers firmly and pull them back toward your forearm. Sink your elbow down so your fingertips and your elbow point towards the floor. Stretch smoothly and evenly without jerking movements. Slowly decrease the distance between your fingertips and your forearm. Begin with your palm facing down. Grasp your hand right next to your wrist. Sinking down both elbows evenly, press your hand down with the assistance of your other hand. Slowly decrease the distance between your elbows. Raise your hands above your head so that one thumb on one hand faces forward and the thumb on the other hand faces backwards. The hand with the thumb facing backwards grasps the back of the other hand. Both palms are facing the same direction. Pull your wrist straight down. Stretch your hand with your thumb facing forward. Keep the fingertips of the hand pointing up while sinking your wrist. With your palms pressed together, sink your wrists beneath your elbows. Your fingers point straight up. Push your fingers side to side. Stretch your hands side to side as much as you can without moving your forearms. Grasp the short baton so that both of your thumbs face the same direction. While maintaining a firm grip, rotate your hand on the thumb side so that the wrist is fully rotated, then press the baton down. From this position, raise both arms above your head and place the baton behind your back so that it is parallel to your spine. Your thumb side hand should be lower. Pull down to stretch your other arm. To counter your opponent grabbing your wrist with his opposite hand, raise your forearm up to free your wrist. To maintain control, do not fully break contact. Grab your opponent's wrist with both hands. Swing your arms to twist his arm as you step in. Extend your opponent's twisted arm over your shoulder. As you raise your wrist, your opponent's grip is broken by overextending at his fingers. As you step in, pivot on your left leg if your left hand was grabbed. The opponent's front leg can be locked with your hip. To counter this technique, grab your opponent's wrist before he swings and pivots. Beat him to the pivot. Use your hand that he grabbed to grab his wrist as soon as possible. Extend your opponent's arm over your shoulder, leaning forward so that his back is stretched over your back. This reverses the action so that you end up using the same technique that your opponent meant for you. When your opponent follows his grab with a punch, raise your forearm to grab your opponent's wrist with only one hand. Grab your opponent's punch, then pivot in so you are back to back. Extend your opponent's body over your body. Grab your opponent's punch with your palm up, fingers pointing forward. When executed in one fluent motion, your opponent is off balance and can be thrown down. To counter this technique, take control of your opponent's attempt to grab your punch by sliding your grip to his wrist. Grab his elbow with your other hand and press his arm back. As your opponent attempts to break your grip, you punch. When your punch is deflected, grab his elbow and twist. Pull his elbow in and up and push his wrist back to meet his shoulder. Squeeze his wrist and shoulder together while controlling his elbow. By continuing this motion, pushing his elbow back as you pull his wrist down, pull your opponent down. In this variation, instead of raising your forearm, bring your hand underneath your opponent's grip. Continue to spin your forearm around so it is on top of his wrist as you grab his hand with your other hand. Press straight down with your forearm. To twist his wrist, keep his fingers pointing up as you press down with your forearm. Lower your center of balance with his, sinking accordingly so that you are not overextended. If your opponent is leaning slightly back, step in and press his fingers forward over your forearm. This technique is similar to the previous, however, you must be sensitive to which direction your opponent is leaning to take advantage of this weakness. Once your opponent's arm is twisted, it locks so that it cannot bend. By pushing forward on the wrist, when the arm is in this position, the entire body is moved. Stay with your opponent so as not to release the arm twist. If your opponent is leaning slightly forward, pull back with your forearm as you press his fingers back. Lock his wrist between your hand and forearm. Just as you step forward to push forward, step back to pull back. In each of these counters, press on your opponent's fingers back as if to make them touch his forearm over your wrist. You can add leverage by pressing your elbow into his. To counter this technique, follow your opponent's motion, stepping in as he pulls you forward. Even though he has your arm extended, he fails to pull you off balance. With your other hand, grab your opponent's forward leg. Lift his leg to throw him down. You may follow him down to maintain control. step in so that your leg is behind your opponent's leg. Sink your hips beneath his for better leverage. Do not lean too far forward to lift his leg, or this may provide an opening. Grab his leg behind the knee. You can add leverage by pushing with your waist. This technique is similar to the previous. However, the throw is done with the waist alone. Use your leg to trap your opponent's leg so he cannot step back. Use your waist to push your opponent over your leg. If your opponent pushes your wrist forward, pivot with his push. Lean forward to alleviate some of the pressure he exerts on your arm. Turn and swing your free arm to chop across your opponent's neck. By spinning with his push, the momentum of your opponent's attack is channeled into your counterattack. He is deflected to the side as you spin. In this variation, you spin as your opponent attempts to take you down. Lean forward to alleviate the twist. Since your body is closer to the ground, you cannot pivot for the chop. Roll forward to unwind your arm and escape your opponent's grasp. If your opponent gets your shoulder to the ground before you begin your row, you are trapped. This spin and row is executed in one fluent motion. After completing this movement, immediately locate your opponent's position, since this is only an escape. To counter your opponent grabbing your wrist with his same hand, raise your forearm up to break your opponent's grip. Grab your opponent's wrist with both hands, step in, pivoting on your forward leg. Hyperextend your opponent's elbow over your upper arm. To maintain control, do not fully break contact with your opponent. Your arms follow the circular pattern of your pivoting step, twisting your opponent's arm. Press your opponent's wrist down as you lift his elbow up with your forearm. To counter this technique, grasp your opponent's elbow before he sets it underneath your own elbow. Push his elbow up and grab his wrist with your other hand. Pull his wrist down to hyperflex his elbow. Pull his wrist down towards the center of his back while keeping control of his arm with your other hand. By continuing to pull down, you can take down your opponent. Push your opponent's elbow towards his front as you shift your extended arm towards his back. Your grabbed wrist will break his grip at his fingers. When your opponent follows his grab with a punch, grab his punch and pull it across his body. Grabbing both wrists, twist his arms to take him down. Lifting his grabbing arm up, push his punching arm down so that his arms tie each other up. While his arms are twisted, yours must be aligned comfortably. To counter this technique, when your opponent catches your punch, do not let him cross your arms. Step in, extending your punching arm across his throat, while pulling his other arm across your body. Press into his throat with your punching arm to take him down. As you step in, place your front leg behind your opponent's leg to trip him. Scissor his body between your punching arm and your front leg while restraining his extended arm. In this variation, raise your hand from the outside of your opponent's wrist instead of the inside. Grab and twist his arm. Step in and grab just above your opponent's elbow. Pivot and pull him down. By controlling both ends of your opponent's forearm, you can control his entire arm and his body will follow. Press down on his elbow while pulling up his wrist. To counter this technique, step behind your opponent's front leg as he begins to press down on your arm. Grab his front leg with your free hand and lean into his body to take him down. As you fall together, land on top of your opponent with all the force of your fall pointed on your elbow. Step in as close as you can, grabbing your opponent's knee. Maintain control of his legs once on the ground, attacking with your other hand. In a variation to this counter, as your opponent grabs your elbow, remove his hand with your other hand, extend his arm, and press down on his elbow with your forearm, trapping his other hand under his armpit. Pull your opponent's elbow in the same direction of his press, sliding your elbow up his arm. Press down on his arm as you pull his wrist up. To counter this technique when your opponent follows with a punch, intercept his punch and cross his arms. Step behind his foot, pushing his grabbing hand up to trip him. Press his punching hand down as you lift his grabbing hand up, crossing his arms above his elbows. You can lock your opponent's knee with your own knee for the trip. To counter this technique, pull his arm straight with his grabbing hand. Wrap his other arm around his neck, locking it over his opposite shoulder, pulling him back so he loses his balance. Raise his extended arm up and back, pinning his folded arm. Pull his arm down as you push his extended arm back to take him down. Pivot your body to prevent your opponent from crossing your arms and locking them. Step behind your opponent so he cannot lock your leg. Pull your opponent's wrists as far apart as you can, keeping his folded arm close to his body. This locks his entire upper body, so when you raise his extended arm, his whole body must follow. Follow the direction of your block to extend your opponent's punching arm behind him. You must cross your opponent's arms before he crosses your arms to reverse this technique. To counter your opponent grabbing your wrist with both hands, step in with an elbow strike to the solar plexus to loosen his grip. Grab the hand that is under your arm, spin the arm he grabbed over his shoulder, push his shoulder forward, taking him down. Pivot your arm where your opponent grabs you for the strike. Wrap his arm with your own while you keep his wrist restrained with your other hand. Press his shoulder to the ground while extending his shoulder with your arm or shoulder. In this variation, begin with the elbow strike, then step in again, grabbing his elbow with your free hand. Push his elbow up and grab his wrist with your other hand. Pull his wrist down as you push his elbow back to lock his arm and take him down. Step between your opponent's legs. You must take over your opponent's personal space quickly so that he cannot step back and recover his balance. To counter this technique, block your opponent's elbow strike to the side while maintaining a grip on his wrist. Push his elbow over and down while keeping hold of his wrist. You may take a small step back to give you more time to block the elbow strike. Control his forearm by controlling his wrist and elbow. In this variation, push your opponent's elbow the other direction, pushing it down, then circling up to twist his arm. Place your shoulder against his shoulder, locking his arm. Extend his elbow back to pull him off balance. Pivot and step, turning your opponent so that his back faces your side. Push his elbow up as you pull down on his wrist. Here the opponent completes his elbow strike and grabs your arm under his arm for a takedown. Grab his hand without releasing the striking arm. Wrap his grabbing hand around his torso and extend his striking arm. Raise his extended wrist while pressing down with your other arm. Control his extended arm at the wrist and shoulder while restraining his other arm by wrapping it underneath his arm. Once you have locked your opponent's arm, lifting his wrist forces him to lean forward and lose his balance. As he steps forward to regain his balance, spin him around so that he fails. Spin your opponent around you so that he must travel farther than you for each circle. Make him pivot around you to maintain your advantage. Here, your opponent follows the elbow strike by pushing your elbow down instead of grabbing your arm. Pivot with his push to chop his neck. Wrap both of his elbows with your chopping arm, squeeze his elbows together, and lift up to uproot his balance. Release your backhand and push his shoulder down while maintaining control of his elbows. Pivot to alleviate the pressure on your arm and spin into the chop. Once you lift your opponent off balance, push him over with your other hand. To counter your opponent grabbing both of your wrists, raise your wrists to extend your opponent's fingers. Grab his wrists and twist his palms up so that his thumbs face away from his body. Raise his hands, locking his arms. Pull his thumbs toward you while pushing the other side of his wrist away from you. After you twist your opponent's wrist, focus on one arm by grabbing that elbow. Push wrist to his shoulder, then push his elbow up. Step behind his leg to trip him. While pressing his wrist to meet his shoulder, push up and back on his elbow. Push his elbow past his hips to upset his balance. Trap his leg so that he cannot step back to regain his balance. In this variation, raise only one wrist, breaking his grip. Step behind him, extending your free arm to chop across his neck. Use his neck chop to take him down. Once you break his grip, follow his arm straight up to his neck. Trap his arm with your body. In this variation, break one grip on one side. Push that arm with your forearm so that you can grab his forearm with your other hand. Maintain contact with his fingers. Then push them down towards his elbow to hyperextend his wrist. When you break his grip, follow the extension of his fingers with your wrist. Grab his forearm and press the back of his fingers to the back of his forearm. Raise your wrist to break his grip to grab his forearm. Here, you break his grips consecutively. Fold his arm and step in to get better leverage. To take him down, step behind him to lock his leg. Move directly from pushing his fingers down to chopping across his neck. To counter this technique, extend one hand and retract the other to regain control of the momentum. Re-establish your grip with your retracted hand. Chop across his neck with your extended hand. When your opponent breaks your grip, follow his momentum to grab his wrist and chop his neck. Pull his arm while you chop forward. Push against his neck to take him down. To counter this technique, protect your neck. Maintaining contact with your opponent, re-establish your grips. Twist his retracted arm from underneath and cross it over his other arm. While keeping his extended arm locked, push his twisted arm down over it. When your opponent extends and retracts his arms, follow his momentum to cross his elbow and tie up his arms. By tying up his arms, you can lock his entire body. Set your stance and lean forward to bring his whole body forward. To counter grabbing your wrist with his opposite hand from behind, press into his grip while stepping back into him. Grab his elbow with your free hand while pressing down with your other hand. Push his elbow up as you press the back of his hand to his forearm. Use your grabbed wrist to hyperextend your opponent's wrist. Maintain a lock on your opponent's arm by restraining his elbow. To counter this technique, add your free hand to your grasp of your opponent's wrist. Do not let go of his wrist when he attempts to hyperextend your wrist. Pull his arm across your shoulder, hyperextending his elbow and shoulder. Follow the momentum of your opponent's attempt to grab your elbow. Bring his arm across your shoulder with his palm facing away from his body. To counter your opponent grabbing your wrist with his same hand, pivot and raise your arm to break his grip. Grab his wrist and twist his arm. Step in and add your free hand to push his elbow. Twist his arm until it locks. Press down on his elbow while restraining his wrist. To counter this technique, pivot and step to alleviate the torque on your arm. Grab his wrist while placing your elbow over his other arm. Turn your body so he loses grip on your elbow. Push up on his chin while keeping hold of his wrist to hyperextend his neck. Follow the momentum of your opponent's attempt to push down on your elbow. Pivot your body so he cannot secure the lock on your arm. In this variation, grab your opponent's wrist and twist his arm over to expose his underarm. Instead of grabbing his wrist, grab the soft underside of his upper arm. Pinch deep into the gap between the biceps and triceps muscles to reach the brachial artery and nerves. Twist your opponent's wrist so that he lifts his elbow. Maintain your grip on his wrist to control his arm so that you can focus on the pinch. To counter this technique, do not let your opponent bend your elbow. Follow the momentum of his arm twist to break his pinch on the underside of your arm. Grab the underside of his arm and pinch. Penetrate the gap between his muscles to reach his nerves and arteries. Push his arm up to upset his balance. By stepping forward with this push, you can take him down. As you begin your arm twist, you are open for a punch. Intercept this punch with your free hand. Press down on the back of his arm to hyperextend his elbow. Grab his punch so that both of your palms end facing the same direction when you push down on his arm. By stepping in front of his foot, you can trip him when you push his arm down. This locks his leg, so he cannot step forward to regain his balance. To counter your opponent grabbing your wrist with both of his hands from behind, react as if he only grabbed you with his opposite hand. Press the back of his hand to his forearm as you step in and push his elbow up. To take down your opponent from this position, step behind his leg. Raise his elbow as you press down on his hand to upset his balance. Push him backwards across your leg. To counter this technique, reach underneath your opponent's elbow as he attempts to raise your elbow. Press his elbow up, then over as you control his wrist with your other forearm. Press his palm into your body with your forearm, locking his wrist. Push his elbow down, sinking with him to take him down. Follow the momentum of his arm twist attempt to switch control from one of his arms to the other. Control his forearm by the wrist and elbow. In this variation, pivot and grab his wrist with your grasped hand. Place your free hand under his chin and push up to hyperextend his neck. Wrap your grasped hand around your body so that it is by your hip. Pull his wrist using your whole body. To counter this technique, maintain your grip on his hand and intercept his hand as he reaches for your chin. Extend his attacking hand, crossing his arms behind his back. Maintain your grip on his same hand instead of letting him grab your opposite hand. Hyperextend his attacking arm by turning his palm away from his body and pressing his elbow across his other wrist. Follow the momentum of your opponent's attempt to pivot out by continuing his arm movement until it is hyperextended. In this variation, your opponent maintains his grip on your opposite hand. Cover your chin with your free forearm and extend his arm as in the previous technique. Intercept his attacking hand by pushing his forearm aside with your forearm. Hyperextend his elbow or his shoulder. In this variation, grab your opponent's wrist and pivot. Strike just above his elbow with your free forearm. Press down on his upper arm to take him down. Keeping his wrist at the center of your back, lock his arm by pressing down with your wrist and forearm. In this variation, grab your opponent's wrist and pivot. Bring your free arm under his elbow and grab above his shoulder. Hyperextend his elbow. Control his arm at his wrist and shoulder. Hyperextend his elbow across your upper arm. In this variation, instead of pushing his shoulder back, pull his shoulder forward to take him down. Pull his wrist as you turn so that you maintain the hyperextension of his arm. Your whole body locks his arm. To counter either of the last two variations, intercept your opponent's free hand as he reaches under your arm. Maintain your grip on his other hand. Raise his wrist up as you press down just above his elbow. Pivot with your opponent, constantly pressing down on his shoulder and lifting his wrist. Hyperextend both his shoulder and his elbow. To counter your opponent grabbing both of your wrists from behind, grab one of his wrists, pivot, and twist his arm. Cross his arms, trapping his other arm under your grabbing arm, between your upper arm and your torso. This arm is trapped by both your arm and your opponent's own twisted arm. By twisting his arms around each other, you can upset your opponent's balance. Lean your body into your opponent's body to push him down. As you turn, extend your opponent's fingers to break his grip. Maintain contact to establish a grip on his wrist and twist. Sink your elbow to trap his other hand, leaning into him with your body. Pivot and push his shoulder down with your other hand, while maintaining the twist on his arm. Bring the hand of his twisted arm up to his shoulder. Follow the momentum of your pivot to get behind your opponent so that you can push his shoulder down before he frees his arm. Once you have his shoulder, focus on that arm twist. To counter this technique, follow his momentum to pivot in, jamming his attempt to grab your wrist. Maintain your grip on his other hand, pulling it behind his back. Push his arms together using your upper arm, crossing them behind his back. Pull him backwards to take him down. In this variation, lean forward to raise your wrist to break his grips. Turn and step behind and hook his leg with yours. Push his upper body across your leg with your arm to take him down. Grab both of his upper arms as he goes down. Squeeze his elbows together to maintain control of his arms. Lean forward to loosen your opponent's grips, then turn to completely free your wrists. Follow your opponent's arms up for the push. Hook his legs so he cannot step back to regain his balance. To counter your opponent grabbing your upper arm, grab his hand with your free hand and pin it to your arm. Circle your grabbed arm over, then down to hyperflex his wrist. In this variation, grab your opponent's hand and twist his arm so his palm faces up. Press his palm towards his forearm. Use your grabbed arm to press down on the elbow, locking his whole arm. To take him down, bring his forearm to the ground with his fingers twisted up. To counter this technique, intercept your opponent's wrist as he attempts to grab your elbow. Straighten his arm and hyperextend his elbow. Fold your arm, trapping his upper arm under your armpit. While twisting his palm so that it faces up, bear down on your shoulder with your body. Fold your arm before your opponent fully straightens it. His grip will loosen when you hyperextend his other arm. Follow your opponent's momentum, turning with his attempt to twist your arm. In this variation, swing your grabbed arm over his forearm and grab his elbow. Trap his hand in your armpit and push his elbow up. To counter your opponent grabbing your upper arm from behind, swing your arm around to push his elbow up. Use your free hand to push his upper body, upsetting his balance. Sink down with your opponent as he falls. Press his shoulder to the ground while keeping his elbow locked. To counter this technique, change your grasp from his upper arm to his wrist. Place your other hand under his elbow and push up. Pull his hand to his shoulder to lock his arm. Push his elbow back to take him down. In this variation, the hand positions reverse. The action in the arm lock is the same. Pivot your body so that your movement is minimal as your opponent is pulled off balance. Hyperflex his elbow while you press his elbow past his shoulder.